good morning or afternoon, students, depending on when you're viewing this. This is the Cell Respiration Podcast, so take your time taking the notes. If you need to stop, just press the pause button and get down the information. If you have any questions about the notes, please feel free to ask me or ask one of your other teachers, or come see me during typing time. This is about cell respiration. So we'll start off talking about the producers, which is all about the photosynthesis. Remind you that producers are the ones that get their energy from the sun, and on the energy pyramid, these are the ones at the bottom. These are the ones that convert that sunlight into chemical energy. Cell respiration is about the consumers. Right? The consumers get their energy from the producers. They consume their food and turn it into an energy molecule called ATP. So a definition of this would be converting the energy in glucose that the photosynthesizers make or the producers make and turning that into a usable form of energy called ATP. Mind you that ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It has three phosphates, and when you break apart that last phosphate, you get a lot of energy released. So the point of the consumers is to consume food to make ATP, just so you can break it apart for the energy. And again, this whole process of doing that is called cell respiration. So where are we getting this energy? Where are the producers getting this energy from? And it's the plants and animals that get their energy from chemical compounds in like carbohydrates or sugars. And once we consume those, we break bonds, and that ATP and energy is released. So again, the consumers consume these energy storing molecules like sugars or carbohydrates or glucose just to make this molecule called ATP. And once we have that ATP molecule, we can break it apart and we can use that energy for things like movement or growing or just simply respirating or breathing. If we want to look at a typical definition of cell respiration, we're looking at a process by which chemical energy in glucose is broken down into ATP. And going back to the producers again, all we're talking about here is an energy transfer. We start out with all the energy on this planet comes from the sun, and it just gets transferred to these glucose molecules through photosynthesis. Once we consume these glucose molecules, we make ATP, and then we break that apart to use that energy for life processes. So all we're talking about here between photosynthesis and respiration is just a transfer of energy from one molecule to the next. And again, an organism uses glucose and oxygen to do this. Glucose is the energy storing molecule. Oxygen helps us break it down or convert ADP to ATP. And of course, we release carbon dioxide and water as waste products. Both plants and animals do use cell respiration. Keep in mind that plants go through photosynthesis so they can then go through cell respiration, not so we can eat them. Looking at the cell respiration equation, we're going to kind of skip around. You may or may not have some more detailed notes in your note packet, but let's take a look at the equation, and you should recognize this equation because it's the same thing as photosynthesis, only backwards. Right? This time we start out with glucose, the food, we breathe in oxygen, and that's going to give you carbon dioxide as a waste. We breathe that out, we make some water, but the big thing, we make that energy, that ATP molecule. So this is the same thing as photosynthesis, just backwards. If we put a little arrow pointing the other way and change ATP to sunlight, we'd be all set. If you're asking yourself, what are these sixes doing in front of these molecules? Again, in chemistry, it's important that we have the same number of molecules on each side of the equation. So if we have 6 oxygens over here, we've got to have 6 oxygens over here. So I wouldn't worry too much about that in relation to our class. But if you see an equation like this, that's all that's happening. Is that it's called balancing equation. You'll get into more about this with when you get into chemistry. So how does cell respiration work? There's 3 stages of cell respiration. The The first stage is called glycolysis, literally meaning to break apart glucose. Lysis means to break. The Krebs cycle, named after a scientist called Hans Krebs, and electron transport. And that's exactly what we're going to do is transport electrons. So step one is glycolysis. And again, based on the definition, we are lysing glucose or breaking apart glucose. And this takes place in the cytoplasm. So if you eat food, and this goes back to the last chapter, getting things into your and out of your cells, you eat glucose or you eat food and it has to cross the cell membrane. And in your cytoplasm, there are enzymes that are going to break apart a molecule of glucose. You split glucose in half, you end up with what we call two molecules of pyruvate. And these two molecules of pyruvate, the energy in that is enough to make just some ATP and some electrons are produced. And we're going to use that ATP and those electrons later on in the process. So here we have a diagram, and you have this in your notes, so please fill this in. You have glucose that gets broken apart in the cytoplasm, literally split in half, and when you break glucose in half, it's called pyruvate. Electrons are made, some ATP is made. That's not a lot. You can't even blink your eyes with two molecules of ATP. This is typically called an anaerobic process, meaning that we do not need oxygen. And that's why aerobics or aerobic exercise needs oxygen here. You're moving around, you're using energy, and you need oxygen to do so. We don't need oxygen here. So this is an anaerobic process, and only two molecules of ATP are made. And this is not a lot of energy, so we need to get more. All right, moving along here in our podcast here. Once you make those two pyruvate molecules, we're going to move in slowly into the mitochondria. This is what you're typically used to seeing when it comes to making ATP, or this is what's the powerhouse of the cell. And it's the powerhouse is because this is where we make the ATP. So just backing up a bit again, we've split glucose in half, and we have these two pyruvate molecules. We've made some energy or some ATP, and we've made some molecules, but now we still have all this energy in the pyruvate molecules that we can't use yet. So in the mitochondria, one pyruvate molecule enters at a time and goes through a series of reactions. And in the end, we break apart that pyruvate, and two more molecules of ATP are produced and lots of electrons. And the electrons are what have most of the energy. And in that process of doing this, we release carbon dioxide as a gas. And if you think back to what glucose is C6H12O6. And this will become a little more apparent when we look at the equation again. But the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen is in that pyruvate. And so when we break that apart, we are going to release some carbons and oxygens as a waste product. And we're going to keep the hydrogens and get rid of the carbon and oxygens, and we breathe that out as gas. So every time you take a breath out, you breathe out. You're breathing out carbon dioxide, which is just leftover food molecules. I don't know if you've ever thought about it that way, but if you have a Snickers bar or a Reese cup bar and you eat it, every time you take a breath out, you are releasing some of that leftover Snickers bar in a sense. So here's a diagram of it. Please fill this in your notes. Again, we have pyruvate that goes in, carbon dioxide goes out, we make some ATP, but lots of electrons. And again, this ATP, not a lot of energy. You can't even blink your eye with that. So we've now made electrons in two of these processes. Electrons in the glycolysis, and lots of electrons in the Krebs cycle. And here's more of a complicated version of it, and we won't go into this much detail. If you ever take AP biology, you will have to know this whole process. And again, if you look at the bottom here, and this is similar to photosynthesis, the electrons that we're talking about are NADH and FADH2. And those H's come from the glucose that was broken down. Remember, glucose is C6H12O6. The C and the O's get released as carbon dioxide gas. All the H's get tagged on here to these molecules, so we then can use that energy to make ATP. So now we're moving into the electron transport. We're still in the mitochondria. We haven't left. We made a little bit of ATP, but not much, 4 altogether. And so the electrons from the Krebs cycle enter the electron transport chain, and this is where oxygen is required. So we breathe in oxygen, and that oxygen, there's enough energy in that with the oxygen to produce 32 molecules of ATP. Right, that's a lot of energy. And those H's that were, I'm going to back up a bit. The H's that were down here combined with the oxygen to make water as a byproduct, as a waste almost. And so those FADHs and those NADH2s, in that process of making water, we convert ADP to ATP. And now we have a lot of energy. So this is the picture. We have that process of the H's, and making some waters in combination with oxygen. That's enough to, that whole process puts a phosphate onto ATP, making our ADP, making an ATP. You don't have to know this picture, but this is sort of how the electron transport works. And again, you see these proteins in the cell membrane moving things in and out. So it's important that you understand things are still having to come in and out of the cell. So here's an overview. You have an overview in your notes. We have the glycolysis that makes glucose to pyruvate. We make some ATP, make some electrons. This is in the cytoplasm. Then we go into the Krebs cycle, named after Hans Krebs. We breathe out carbon dioxide, make some ATP, make lots of electrons. All those electrons go into the ETC, the electron transport chain. And if oxygen is available, we make lots of ATP. So altogether, we're at about 36 to 38 ATP. Some of these processes do need energy to run the process. For instance, glycolysis, you need energy to break apart glucose. So really, we make 4 ATP, but we use 2, so it's a net gain of like 2. So in the end, we have about 36 ATP made. That's a lot of energy. Now we can actually move and breathe and grow. Through some of these review questions here. Okay, it's important to talk about things like anaerobic respiration. What happens if in the electron transport there's no oxygen available? Or what happens in the glycolysis if there's no oxygen available? All right, that's called anaerobic respiration. And some organisms actually live in an oxygen-free environment. So how do they get their energy? And it's called fermentation. Right, so there's two types of anaerobic respiration. Alcoholic produces ATP and ethyl alcohol, and lactic acid. And this is typically what happens in us. If we cannot get enough oxygen in our bodies to produce the energy we need for that activity, then we start to produce lactic acid. We still make ATP without oxygen. We just don't make enough. And you can see the grand totals here. And aerobic respiration, when oxygen is available, it's 36 ATP, and anaerobic, it's about 4 altogether. So there's a big difference. And this is when we get muscles start to burn in exercise. So if we look at, this is just a complicated version of a complicated diagram of what's going on with anaerobic and aerobic respiration. If we look at energy and exercise, the quick energy, in the first 30 seconds of an intense activity, cells are going to use ATP that's already present in the cell. Right? The next 90 seconds will produce ATP from glycolysis or fermentation based on how much food is available and how much oxygen you can get into your body. And lactic acid is going to build up at this point if we can't get enough oxygen into our cells. If we're looking at long-term energy, cell respiration is the only way to produce enough ATP to sustain exercise. 20 minutes, cells used stored glycogen in muscles and other tissues. Glycogen is just carbohydrates that are used for long-term storage. So we have all this energy and glycogen in our bodies. We break that down to get the glucose out of it. And if oxygen is available again, that we can make our ATP. If not, we're going to get some lactic acid buildup, which again makes our muscles sore. And then after that first 20 minutes, it begins to break down other stored molecules like lipids. So again, if we want to look at what our body breaks down to use glucose, first are the carbohydrates, in a form of glycogen or carbohydrates or sugar that's immediately available. And then if we don't have that available, then we go to lipids or fats. So people talk about losing weight, they have to use all their glucose or glycogen first before they start burning the fat. If by chance we don't have fat available in our body, we've used all our fat, then we're going to start using protein for energy. And that's when we start losing muscle mass. And you think of individuals that have diseases like bulimia or anorexia, when they're literally skin and bones, the reason is they've used all their glucose. They have no glucose or energy. They have burned up all their fat in their bodies, and so the only energy they have left to use to go through cell respiration is the protein. So they've used their muscle for energy. It's literally your body is eating itself just to function. So these conclude your cell respiration notes. If you have any questions, please see Mr. Matthew.